All right. Good evening, Dr. Wilder, and to all my English 433 classmates. I do hope you enjoyed reading Ernest Hemingway's In Our Time, and even if you didn't enjoy it, I do hope this week's unit helped you synthesize and understand the work, and as well give you a contextual baseline for the era in which Hemingway was writing, along with the other authors that we'll be discussing this class. So again, my name is Benjamin, and I was assigned the article for this week's discussion titled Very Short Stories, The Miniaturization of War in Hemingway's In Our Time by Dr. Jim Barloon. Dr. Barloon is an associate professor of English at the University of St. Thomas in Houston. He received his PhD in English from the University of Kansas in 1995. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to locate too many facts about him and couldn't find maybe a CV that I was looking for or any other articles that he'd published. But as a University of Maryland English student, I feel more than comfortable with doing a close reading of the text and allowing the author's ethos to shine forth in the text itself. So to begin, the article, I would say, is unique in that it tended to bury the explicit argument of the author well into the text itself. There's a real development and buildup of secondary sources and his research and discussing the literature as far as analyzing Hemingway's work. So with that in mind, I will parallel my own analysis of his article, how he structured it himself, with talking about his overarching argument towards the conclusion of this presentation. First, Dr. Barloon gives the reader a lot of supplementary secondary research to both support his argument and his findings, and just to show the readers how many different interpretations there are of Hemingway's text and how those different and how those are similar. One researcher that he discussed was Philip Young, who was a former professor of English at Penn State and a Hemingway expert. And Professor Young subscribes to the argument that of all the pieces in Our Time are inseparable from the war, rather than dealing with directly the actual war itself, it shows how the war affects the personal relationships of the characters. So in essence, World War I is the pervasive dark force of this era. And even if it's not being addressed or dealt with directly, it affects every aspect of life in that era. And then several critics believe that that this work was indeed a novel, not just a collection of short stories and snippets. They tend to think it was a fragmented precursor to A Farewell to Arms, if you're familiar with Hemingway. I am not, so I haven't read that one yet. But he also posed the question that if it is a war novel, then why does so many of the stories don't take place anywhere near the war? A lot of Nick Adams narratives are really far away from the action. And the answer he gives is that because the actual war is omitted in many of the actual stories involving the characters, that it's the way the characters dealt with the war, that the war was too much to be confronted directly. So he wanted his characters to have an escape from the scenes depicted in those vignettes. Most notably, he mentioned the Big Two-Hearted River pieces, in which Nick Adams returns to the river as a source of calm and escape. And we definitely see that in that story where, he's fishing, he's camping, he's just grilling out on the fire, and he keeps saying, this is good. And you get that sense that there has to be an escape from the war, and that's how present it is in the characters' lives, that they have to actually go and escape. So the article presents us with also the contrary view of In Our Time as being a war-torn novel loosely strung together, he references an argument by, hopefully I'm saying this right, Deborah Modelmog, and that this is a very cohesive work, contrary to what other critics believe. And it's held together by the consciousness of Nick Adams and that narrative. And you definitely see that Nick Adams narrative bookends this work. And it's definitely a tightly threaded narrative in that sense, that we keep returning to Nick Adams' story. So I can see that as well. Jeffrey Myers, the author, references, and I think I really liked his graceful literary analogy, saying that the independent yet related pieces are like a sequence of sonnets. So any of you English majors out there taking any Shakespeare courses, you know that each sonnet stands on itself like these stories do, but also they're very closely related and they create a literary whole, I'll say. So I like that analogy as well, and I think that really worked well. And I also liked how Dr. Barloon gives us Hemingway's own analysis of In Our Time. And parallel to his writing, he just said, it has a pretty good unity. So definitely, even when he was asked about it, he was very succinct and nonchalant about it. So Barloon proposes the idea that whatever unification that critics want to give Hemingway's work and what us as readers subscribe to, it really can't be categorized with the traditional sense of a novel that the literary world had known to that point. He references Ian Watts, what he calls the landmark work called The Rise of the Novel, and where the author says that the novel distinguished itself by the use of past experience through present action, that the past is influencing the present narrative. And I think you get that in this, but what Barloon's argument is that the war that's referenced In Our Time, World War I, has scattered the narrative so much that there's very little cohesion in the traditional sense. You definitely see that as you were reading. You may have thought, like, well, how's this relate to this? Everything's very spread out geographically, and even you get a sense of different timings, both before and after the war. So I definitely see that argument as well. So after what I felt was a concise and very adequate review of the secondary research as it pertains to Hemingway's In Our Time, he definitely turns to more of a close reading analysis of the text, and primarily focusing on the vignettes, the snippets, if you will, of the war scenes and other horrific scenes as evidence to support what he finds while doing this close reading. Here I was glad to see that many of what he found in the text related to what our class discussed in our discussions. For instance, there's a pervasive feeling that Ernest Hemingway was granting male narrative a very high privilege at the expense of the female characters. I know someone mentioned in their post The Cat in the Rain, and the author mentions that as well, how the wife's name is never mentioned, and she's just known as like a she or her. And then, the author acknowledges this point that Hemingway definitely focuses on the male point of view and kind of dismisses the female aspect of it. And I don't think he gives a very satisfactory explanation as to why that is. He does reference that many of the soldiers in the snippets aren't giving names, but you definitely get a feel that of all the developed characters, the male ones have the most of his attention. Nick, I think his friend Bill, Krebs, they're all given a lot of attention. And even Nick's girlfriend, Marjorie, she is only known to the readers from the male perspective. You see Bill and Nick talking about Marjorie, and you only get their opinion of her. You don't really see her side of the story. So I can see where that would be an issue with some readers, and I don't think Dr. Barloon really addressed that adequately in this article. So he also considers the placement of the vignettes, and I'm sorry if I'm saying that word wrong, of them themselves, and if their arrangement can actually then excuse me, the vignettes themselves, if they can provide a unity within the work as a whole, just by themselves. And he supposes that because of the lightning flash delivery of each vignette, it just hits the reader as like a one-page thing, that it definitely permits it to stand alone, like that scene stands alone to affect the reader. But it's not really a cohesion aspect. It's more of like a cumulative effect of the horrors and atrocities, and they can be grouped together as these are what has happened in this era. So he definitely feels that they go together as building this effect of the scenes that were depicted and the horrific experiences of the era. And another aspect that he dealt with, and I think that a lot of us discussed in our class discussion as well, is that there's a lot of his narrative style, his prose style is very detached, very nonchalant, straightforward, not a lot of emotion or granting the characters in the vignettes any emotion. It's just more of a newspaper kind of style. And I agree, and I think that the author of this article, attributes that to Hemingway's training as in the journalism field. You definitely get a sense of, when you're reading these vignettes, the who, what, when, where, why. You get, the placement of the soldiers, the sequence of events, the placement of the artillery, what happened when it's just very sequential, factual writing. And I think I noticed that reading the author bio after I read In Our Time, that he was in the newspaper business, so that made sense to me as well. And I think a lot of people in our class got that sense like I did. Another thing that he discusses when he looks at the text is how Hemingway incorporates non-combatants into these scenes and these vignettes. For example, and I apologize if I mispronounced this, on the Quai of Simna, he describes women and babies and how they're also dying in this battle, and they're also being cast aside, and they're really in the crossfire. So, and he also describes in one of the vignettes the hurting of the old men and the old women, and he likens it to being herded like cattle. So you definitely see in Hemingway's writing that this war is all-encompassing to the entire civilization. So you get to see that also on a physical level, and then the emotional level in the stories and how it affects the characters' interpersonal relationships. Finally, he ends on a literary device note. He notices the narration shifts, the first person singular, third person singular, third person plural. And what this inconsistency does for the author, and I tend to agree, is it instills a sense of an uncertainty within the reader. Each new story is there, and it's like a rapid fire delivery. There's a rapid fire shift in scene, plot, structure, characters, and it really brings out the rapid fire aspect of war and the change and the constant uncertainty, and he instills that in his readers. So that really leads me to this article and what is really the crux of what Dr. Barloon's trying to get at. So I will read it as he wrote it, just for its elegant, convoluted nature. He says his main point is that Hemingway wrote a series of discrete, disconnected sketches about war, but that war, as Hemingway experienced it, caused him to recognize its absolute dislocating nature. Hemingway adapted the form of his work to the realities of war, realities which resist the diachronic concatenations of a conventional narrative. So really what I think he's trying to say is that Hemingway set out to construct a narrative that was a literary manifestation of the tumult and the ensuing darkness of war, both in the physical aspect, the shifting of scene and events in a rapid fire motion, and also the darkness that and uncertainty that it instills in the collective consciousness of the characters. The writing I thought was both graphic and brooding, as the author of this article agreed with. And I think I agree with this article in that Ernest Hemingway's prose and narrative succeeded in representing that narrative manifestation of the uncertainty and the constant shifting of war and the political and social climate of that era. So I think this article really shows why this is a very poignant novel to start our semester with, and yeah, I think it really set the tone for historical context and also a literary context. So I hope everyone has a good weekend, and I look forward to reading the next novels that we talk about, and enjoy reading. Thank you. Bye.